You can think of your kidneys as this incredible, high-tech filtration system that you own, and it's working 24/7 to keep your blood clean. But what happens when that super important filter gets inflamed and starts to fail? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today, a condition called glomerulonephritis. So let's just start with a really big question. What actually happens when your body's most important sieve, its main filter, gets inflamed? And we're not talking about a simple clog here. This is a fundamental breakdown of the very system that's designed to keep you alive and healthy.
Okay, so the official name for this is glomerulonephritis, or just GN for short. At its core, it's an inflammation of the glomeruli, these teeny tiny, super intricate filtering units inside your kidneys. And here's the absolute kicker. This isn't caused by some outside force. It's an immune-mediated disease. That means your own immune system gets confused and starts attacking these essential filters.
But, how big of a deal is this really? Let's zoom in and take a look at the situation in Indonesia to get a sense of the real-world scale.
Okay, this number is pretty staggering. In Indonesia, glomerulonephritis is the cause behind roughly 27% of all chronic kidney disease cases. Think about that for a second. That's more than 1 out of every 4 people dealing with chronic kidney disease. This makes it a huge public health issue.
And this chart here really puts everything into perspective. It's based on 2020 data from the Indonesia Renal Registry, and it shows the main reasons people end up with end-stage renal disease. Now, you can see hypertension and diabetic issues are the biggest slices of the pie, for sure. But look at primary glomerulonephritis. That's a form of GN. It's responsible for a solid 8% of cases, and that doesn't even count the GN caused by other diseases.
So this all leads to the next logical question, right? Where does glomerulonephritis actually come from? And how do doctors even begin to classify it?
The classification is actually pretty straightforward. Glomerulonephritis is split into 2 main buckets. First, you've got primary GN. That's where the problem starts right in the kidneys themselves. Then there's secondary GN, which is more like collateral damage from another disease happening in the body, like lupus, that also ends up hurting the kidneys. And let me tell you, knowing which type it is, that's absolutely vital because it completely changes how you treat it.
All right, now for the main event. We're going to really visualize the chain reaction inside the body that leads to all this damage to the kidney's filters. This is where things get really fascinating.
First up, let's let our baseline. This is what a healthy glomerulus is supposed to look like. It's this beautiful, complex web of capillaries, special cells, and membranes, all working together perfectly to filter your blood. This is the before picture.
And this is the after. This whole flowchart maps out the devastating cascade of events when things go wrong. Now, don't worry about trying to read every little detail. The big takeaway here is that it all kicks off with an immune trigger at the very top. That one event sets off a chain reaction that ends with the cellular damage you see way down at the bottom. Let's break this down into 4 simple steps. So let's make that complex chart super simple. It really boils down to 4 key stages. First, some kind of immune trigger makes your body produce antibodies. Second, these antibodies grab onto antigens, and they form these little clumps called immune complexes that get stuck in the kidney's tiny filters. Third, this buildup flips the switch on another part of the immune system which unleashes a ton of inflammation. And finally, that whole inflammatory storm directly damages the cells of the glomerulus. It's like a precise step-by-step demolition job.
Okay, so we've seen the problem and we've seen how the damage happens. So how do medical professionals actually fight back? Let's take a look at the playbook for managing this. The goals here are really multi-layered. Doctors are trying to get blood pressure under control, stop protein from leaking into the urine, calm down that overactive immune system, slow down the disease itself, and manage symptoms like swelling. It's a total, comprehensive strategy to protect what's left of the kidney function.
And let's be clear, treatment is definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. The game plan depends entirely on the specific type of GN a person has. For instance, something called minimal change disease often gets better with just a simple course of corticosteroids. But for a much more serious condition like advanced lupus nephritis, you have to bring out the big guns. We're talking high-dose steroids combined with other powerful immunosuppressant drugs.
Now, these strategies aren't just guesses, they're based on solid evidence from international groups like KDI-GO and the national guidelines right here in Indonesia. A key recommendation, for example, is using common blood pressure meds like ACE inhibitors. But here's the cool part.
They're not just for blood pressure, they have a second job, which is to specifically protect the kidneys and reduce that dangerous protein leakage. And that brings us to maybe the most critical part of this whole story. What happens if you do nothing? And why every single day really counts.
The biggest risk, if GN is just left to its own devices, is pretty stark. It's progressive kidney failure. That constant inflammation eventually leads to something called glomerulosclerosis, which is basically permanent scarring of the kidney's filters. And once that scar tissue forms, that damage is irreversible. You can't go back.
So the absolute key is catching it early. And here's the good news. The very first step is incredibly simple. A basic urine test, a urinalysis, can spot the key warning signs: protein in the urine and blood in the urine. A lot of times, these are the very first clues that the filters are in trouble.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. The symptoms of glomerulonephritis are often silent, especially in those early stages. You could feel totally fine while all this damage is happening inside. So it really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? When was the last time you actually had your urine checked?